Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to the Finding Islam podcast. Welcome to our second episode. I'm your host, Abir, the lifestyle editor for Finding Islam. Today, I'm very happy to say I'm joined by three very respected, intelligent brothers, Brother Abdullah, Brother Muhammad, and Brother Khubayb. So, how about you guys introduce yourselves? So, starting with Abdullah, let the people know who you are.
Cool. Assalamu alaikum, guys. I am a contributor at Finding Islam. Personally, I am an undergraduate student of architecture in the UK, and I'm interested in, on a personal capacity, Islamic art. If we, speak of the devil, we'll discuss what that means, perhaps what that could mean. Culture, civilization, and the idea of beauty and how it relates to different parts of life, so politics, etc. That's me. Inshallah, I'll pass on to Mari.
Okay. Salam. My name is Muhammad. My training is I have a master's degree in history and Islamic societies and culture. I am currently a history teacher at an Islamic school. Personally, my interests are in Islamic history, the Islamic world, broadly speaking, philosophy, intellectual history and development, as well as politics, political theory, and philosophy. I hadn't said that already. But yeah, those are kind of broadly speaking my interests. We'll hand it off to Khubayb.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm Khubayb. I guess I did law at undergrad and at master's level, and I'm currently a researcher, a legal researcher, and my interests cover law, of course, Islamic law, Islamic history, aspects of Islamic legal philosophy, and general theories of resistance and so on. Yeah, and translation. Very much interested in the translation of Arabic into English.
Great stuff. Yeah, so it's great to have you guys here. This is it's only our second episode, and it's the first one where it's more than just me talking, which I think is a great way in general to progress with these podcasts. And in true 2020 fashion, this podcast topic is all about labels. It's all about kind of, I suppose, identity politics, and I suppose how we often frame ourselves under these labels, particularly the label of Islamic. Like us four being Muslims and being particularly from the West, I think, or at least living in the West, we tend to notice, I think it's fair to say quite frequently, especially in our generation and on social media, how terms like Islamic history, Islamic culture, so on get thrown around. I imagine particularly if, like yourselves, Khubayb and Marie, given your backgrounds are kind of in the, you study kind of arts degrees. It's like if that, and particularly in like an arts and humanities college as well, that was probably more noticeable as well for you than it was even for myself, because you guys, art students, all about that kind of stuff, and I suppose this, like in our own kind of natural conversation, this stuff, these things tend to come up. And I always find it interesting seeing it's not even purely Islamic stuff, but even non-Muslims, and especially when it comes to politics, like to frame themselves, liberal, conservative, especially in like the US, it's probably strongest. And it tends to then frame their whole way of thinking, their whole identity, and to some level, their personality. And I think you tend to see the same as well within the Muslim space, when it comes to, madahib and or aqidah and these things, in terms of like a history context, you see it a lot with the term Islamic history and so on. Like Marie, I'm sure you've touched on that a lot, in our own kind of conversations. I suppose it's just always a tricky one, how we view kind of a history and what we define as Islamic. It's something I sometimes struggle with myself, in terms of what actually constitutes as Islamic.
Yeah, totally. So like from a historical angle, one thing that historians really like to do that kind of messes things up is they like to draw borders and boundaries. Mainly these are intellectual boundaries and borders and conceptual boundaries. So we talk about the West. What is the West, and what do we mean by the West? This is all, like, the word itself comes to represent something else. And the West, kind of in political parlance, in intellectual stuff, they kind of generally mean Europe and America, but like particularly Britain and America by and large. when they say the West. And this whole idea is also built up on its own set of internal self-conceptions and its own narrative of history, its own developmental narrative and whatnot. And then you get into Islamic, which from just like a purely historical or the label of Islamic. And from a purely historical standpoint, the idea of the Islamic world is just this. It is a world that is commonly defined by Islam. It begins with the Prophet ﷺ, and it continues up until this day, basically. It is a world that is that can be essentialized around the topic of Islam, around the idea of Islam and submission and the faith and whatnot. And then literally everything else gets subsumed under this topic. So then you can talk about Islamic sciences, which, depending on who your audience is, can mean the Islamic religious sciences, or it can mean Islamic science in like the development of the modern secular physical sciences in the Islamic world, depending on contexts and the audience. And then you also have like Islamic poetry, Islamic art, and anything that comes out of whatever we define to be Islamic becomes now Islamic poetry or Islamic art, even though from the Muslim point of view or from the point of view of the people who made it, they may not have classified it as such. And I mean, this is obviously this is glossing over a lot of stuff. There's more nuance when it comes to this. So like people do talk about Arabic poetry or Jahili poetry. It's not that all Arabic poetry now becomes Islamic, but that it falls under generally the banner of the Islamic world. And this comes into this notion of the Islamic world is often juxtaposed with the Christian world. And like I can talk a lot about the creation of these labels and these notions in history and how they're much more problematic than they would seem to be. But that's not necessarily what we're discussing here today.
I think you raised some important points there, Muhammad, and I guess just maybe to bring it down to the individual level to a certain degree, because I think this matter of what is Islamic and what isn't, and how do we go about understanding ourselves in that context. It's come up a lot in situations I would have never expected it to. For instance, I remember when I was at school, and my other Muslim students were always present around us, and for one, even though many of them were not practicing, many of them did not, I guess, want to necessarily become practicing as such. There was always this impression that there is something out there that is good and that is great and good and true, and I don't really understand what it is, perhaps from their perspective, but that's what I belong to and identify with. I always got that impression that even where individuals who I guess were culturally Muslim or something of the sort, even when they did not necessarily understand Islam or have a great interest in pursuing it properly, there was always this kind of firm conviction that somewhere out there there is an Islam, and I belong with that, and it is great and good and true. From that perspective, I guess that's a very broad understanding of the concept. It's just a general thing that all of these people, whether they're practicing or not, feel they identify with, and there is a trend. And actually, I've noticed it might be a bigger trend than perhaps we recognize. That there are many people out there who are Muslims purely for this reason, that they feel like they want to belong to something, and they feel that it is it is correct, but don't necessarily have the willpower to, or whatever it is, to if you understand, I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, I get your point. That you have people who identify as Muslims on a personal level, regardless of how closely they follow the Sharia or the fiqh of Islam, and how well they recognize their own standing with regards to Islamic orthodoxy or understandings of orthodoxy. And that's an entirely kind of, or not separate discussion of Islamic, but that is one of the discussions of like a much more personal discussion, as you said. How do I find myself with regards to this overarching understanding of Islam and Muslimness, basically?
I think it's relevant because yeah, go ahead, please.
I think just to put it in a bit more of a sure, very quickly, just to put it perhaps to be devil's advocate, I think there is a sense of a binary in that there is definitely, to me at least, there's a paradigm which can be considered as Islamic, regardless, and that's what people recognize, perhaps, right? And people who historically live within a quote unquote Muslim area, they generally, what you live within an Islamic paradigm, which is the kind of the culture, essentially, the taboos, the et cetera, the values, the philosophy, most importantly, is inherently Islamic. So you have concepts and ideas which just run through everything, right? Tawheed is something which is present in every kind of quote unquote Islamic piece of culture, regardless of whether the people enacting the culture know whether it is or not. So, for example, this is distinctly different from the idea of Muslim. We'll take the example of art, right? I was looking at a piece of Renovation content. I can't remember what it was. Where the example used was, you have Zayn Malik, who was a Muslim singer, and when he was a Muslim, he wasn't the art he was creating was not Islamic art. It was just a Muslim art. However, you have the Prince of the UK who runs an art foundation in which one of the classes is to teach Arabic calligraphy, which is a distinctly Islamic art, regardless of whether the artist is Islamic or not. It's because the paradigm in which the art is operating is very clear that it is Islamic. For example, we'll talk about in architecture, we have some concepts that are very strong in Islamic architecture, regardless of whether the builders have any idea what they're doing. It's just so wound in that paradigm that it's not recognized anymore. So you have the idea of borders, which are very clear in our art. You'll see that everything is delineated very nicely. Everything is defined very clearly. There's no blending or blurring of different boundaries. Everything is very clear. And we can see how this reflects in our philosophy as well. You have other things like, there's a very common idea of visually, you'll have an element which is a central kind of core element in a piece of art. And there's many elements that break off it and kind of repeat into patterns of infinite multiplicity. And we know exactly what this is referencing, right? This is Tawheed. Regardless of whether the artist knows what they're doing, the philosophy is very easily readable. So I think there's a difference between a kind of Muslim and Islamic. It's typical, right? But I think there is. And you don't have to be, I don't think that the quote unquote Islamic has to come from the quote unquote Muslim.
Yeah,
I think the philosophy stands on its own.
I think
sometimes
I think that's where the nuance of this topic really comes in. It's how the fact that,
jump straight into it. Yeah,
that's, you can have something produced that fits the term Islamic by someone who isn't Islamic, and vice versa as well. And like I'm a practicing Muslim, but I'm also an engineer. But that doesn't mean the engineering work I do is Islamic in any way. Stuff like that, and that applies, I think, to a lot of us in terms of our daily lives. So when it comes to like things like art, I think art, culture, and these things, though, especially, are what people love to label and view as Islamic, because we get that inherent pride. Like whenever we see this amazing structure was designed by a Muslim architect, or like this structure takes inspiration from Islam, like historically Islamic architecture, maybe from Muslim regions, whether it's Turkey, Pakistan, or so on. It fits into that, I think, what Khubayb was touching on, of how people they like to feel pride in who they are and in terms of the group that they're in. I think it's just a very natural human thing. You want to be part of a group, and even if
I would say that maybe I think that what's been criticized as the Orientalists are bunching into Islamic and non-Islamic groups is a problem.
Yeah.
However, from within the paradigm, claiming something as Islamic is something which should be done, because, like, you have Jalaluddin Rumi, who is now the most famous poet in the US, and because we haven't claimed that as inherently from within our paradigm, it's just dissolved until nothing exists anymore. Right? You have a building and you take the foundations out, the building is not going to float on its own, right? That poetry is indistinguishable. It's you can't distinguish that as poetry anymore. It just doesn't exist because the foundations aren't there. That's one side. So I think it's very dangerous to not claim something as Islamic from within. However, from without, to bunch everything together as Islamic is a problem. I think what this might lead to is, instead of saying that this is, for example, Farsi architecture, Turkish architecture is Islamic architecture, instead of saying that, which is like a reductive thing, it's saying all of these different, inherently different styles all possess the same element, which is an Islamic philosophy, and they reflect that. As opposed to, I don't know how to define that difference, but I feel like I think that makes sense. And sorry, Abdul, I think I cut you off.
No, it's fine. I think it's a tricky thing. I think, because I think there's always going to be people upset as well, no matter how you label it. Like if you say, "Oh, this is a great example of Pakistani architecture," like, for example, there's the Faisal Mosque in Islamabad. Someone could look at that and say, "Oh wow, look, this is this incredible architecture in Pakistan, really inspiring Pakistani architecture." But the design for that was actually submitted by a Turkish man. So then, is it Turkish architecture? Do you know? So like that's where it becomes, it's true. Like, I think it's just something that there's no, way to like label everything perfectly.
It's this issue of kind of looking at something kind of from the third person, zoomed out, looking down, as opposed to first person living it, looking at it.
Yep.
Everything we do, like, or not everything we do, but like, well, let me find the right words for this. When we live our lives, and like when we're talking about creating things or working within paradigms or things that are influenced by a much larger, much deeper philosophy, like art or politics or whatever, that have their basis in Islam or in Islamic teachings or in Islamic history, these are things that are naturally Islamic. But then you end up with this kind of multiple definitions of Islam. So like if we're saying that this is an Islamic teaching, then we mean that this is something religious. Whereas if we're talking about something that is cultural, we can be talking about something that is culturally from the Muslim world, that was produced by Muslims within the broader Islamic culture, but not necessarily in line with Islamic teachings or Islamic religious teachings. So something that is like a classic of Islamic or like an Islamic work, 1001 Nights, Alf Layla wa Layla, contains stories within it that in their not all of them essentially conform to orthodox standards of Islamic propriety, subject matter. There's drug use, there's nudity, there are a number of stories within the overarching story of 1001 Nights that are not necessarily religious in nature. So if we're using the term Islamic to denote a strict upholding of like Islamic religious norms and understandings, then something like Alf Layla wa Layla sits outside of that, even though Alf Layla wa Layla itself comes from and is born within an Islamic culture, by and large, having its roots, of course, in the culture of the time, which was obviously touched by these Islamic teachings. But the idea is when kind of we decide to draw borders within the tradition. So this is something that is Islamic in the religious sense. This is something that is Islamic in the cultural sense. And all of these fit within this kind of, or can, if you zoom out far enough, all of these fit within this rather amorphous discussion of Islam, which is then, or the Islamic world, which is then juxtaposed with the Christian world, as if the two are inherently different and essentially incompatible, even though historically there was a lot of like give and take and discussion and kind of like you could have one foot in and out, and this juxtaposition also kind of erases a lot of what went on the borders.
I think actually you raised quite and actually this is in partial response also to you, Abdullah, when you're talking about Rumi and the way he's not the most popular poet in America. When when we speak of something being Islamic, or actually being American even, or any of that sort of I guess a transplant of one thing into another culture and into another context. First of all, when we speak of things that are produced within an Islamic culture, and I don't want to necessarily use that term, because it's when we speak of the context in which many like this art and poetry and so on, architecture was produced, it was a given that the context was Islamic. Everything that the people were interacting with was Islamic. Their very life was an interaction with Islamic norms and rulings and ideas and philosophy and so on and so forth. So whatever they were going to produce was naturally going to be a form of engagement with the tradition, in that sense, with Allah, with Tawheed, with the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with his sunnah and so on. It was a living, it is and was a living part of people's lives. And so even when we I guess consider things that are not necessarily Islamic, like per se, some people bring up the Greek philosophers, for instance, who occupied a tremendous role within I guess the intellectual thought of across Islamic history, and all of these philosophers were given these very Islamic sounding names and so on and so forth. I was reading exactly when I was reading somewhere that when you speak of Aflatun, it's not like speaking of Plato. It's a completely different context. It gives completely different I guess insinuations. Is that the word? Yeah, you occupy a very different kind of intellectual conception of the world. And likewise, when we speak of when an American speaks of Rumi, at least, and I guess in that sense, Rumi has been kind of completely transplanted into American culture and understandings of the world, and in many senses adapted and tamed to reflect only the ideals of that culture. There's some give and take, because any process of transplantation is not a one-way process. There's always going to be a degree of influence, and I guess that's what Muslims are trying to do by taking Rumi back, if you will, if that can be done.
I would say with the case of Rumi, it's less that he's been transplanted and that there was a proper give and take, as opposed to a whitewashing. There's a lot of stuff that's been written recently about the process by which Rumi's poetry, especially the Masnavi, which was considered in some circles to be second only to the Quran in terms of its religious authority, has been entire. That Rumi has gone from a Sufi master and an Islamic spiritualist to just a poet. That all mention to Tawheed, to Islam, which were central to Rumi's personal beliefs, and his work has been stripped away in favor of this kind of liberal, new agey understanding of God and spirituality.
I'm sure the same can be said of, for instance, when any ancient philosophers were transplanted into Islamic philosophy and so on. We're not engaged. No, we're not engaging necessarily with the philosopher per se. We're engaging with them from our Islamic standpoint, and we are in one way or another Islamizing them, particularly in the tradition of Islamic philosophy, where actually some of these philosophers were viewed as an authority. In order for them to be an authority, they need to be Islamized. They have to have that legitimacy, that Islamic legitimacy. For them to have that Islamic legitimacy, you must in some way, shape or form make them into Islamic figures. You understand? So in that way, not only are you Islamizing them, you're also using them to interpret Islam.
I think there might be a difference in that the example of Rumi is a reduction. You're taking away from him and his art. You're minimizing only to the bits which are palatable. Correct me if I'm wrong, Hubei, please, because this is an area of history which I'm very weak on. But when the traditions took from the philosophers, what we call, as in the Greeks. My understanding is that it was perhaps there was a limiting as well, but it was more of a importing them into their life and then just saying they were people to take from. And that's why you have people like Al-Ghazali who deconstructs what they stood for, and explains why it's something that's problematic from our paradigm. I think perhaps if they were palatable in a quote unquote Islamic sense, there wouldn't be a need for Ghazali's work to kind of show why there's a problem there. Whereas with Rumi, it's literally a kind of, the foundations are gone, right, and nothing really exists. It's just the name Rumi now. I don't know. Correct me, inshallah, if I'm.
No, you're completely right in identifying that. Of course, the philosophers, there were many rebuttals against them, and what I guess, because what we're discussing is what is Islamic. This leads us to the question of whether how the philosophers themselves, who were seen as, I guess, heretical, and to this day they are seen as heretical, and not many people perhaps take them seriously as Islamic authorities. They themselves, within their own, I guess, intellectual circles, did try to justify their thought from an Islamic perspective. So even they, first of all, what they thought that what they were doing and what they were engaging in was essentially Islamic. And because they occupied an Islamic milieu, if you will, what they produced can be viewed and is viewed for sure as part of Islamic history, Islamic intellectual production, and so on and so forth. With regards to Rumi, no, of course it. I mean, I don't think there's a. I'm not sure if it's possible to say that they're not part of Islamic intellectual history, because I guess they occupied the time period, and many of them were, I guess, externally at least, Muslim. There is more of a debate when we're talking about can we say that Plato and Aristotle and these pre-Islamic figures, can we speak of them as being Islamic? I think that there is certainly a debate to be had there, but
from that answer to the question, I think what we're kind of reaching here. So you said that even though they weren't distinctly following the overt understanding of Islam, they are still within some nebulous thing called Islamic culture, right? I think what we're perhaps reaching is the idea that this quote unquote Islamic cloud contains the religion of Islam in its purity, right? Not the other way around. The religion of Islam doesn't, because the religion itself can't accommodate for these things, right? Because these things are not really they're just not acceptable, right? So I think you have this cloud in which is the and within the cloud is the pure object, and then you have the roots that kind of come off it. But the thing is, those roots only exist because of the pure object, which we can call it like I don't know, I don't want to say heart because that makes it sound cringy as well, but this one, the source. Because I think what we have a problem where sometimes some people, some historians, they'll completely binarize. Is that a word? I don't know. They'll separate culture and deen, right? And they'll say that, this is not religion, this is culture, and which is so true sometimes. It is not. But when you have 1001 Nights, for example, that book would not exist in the form that it does today without the religion, because they're just so intimately interwoven that they are from one. I mean, the one is from the other, even though it doesn't respect the other. Really, it doesn't respect the deen, but it's still from the deen, and it can't exist without the deen, right? So it's kind of like this amorphous cloud in which you have this kind of excellent center, and everything else is kind of diluted. I don't know if you guys would agree with that model.
I see. I completely see what you're saying. And actually, I guess if we want to go for a very a purist approach to what is Islamic, then of course it would be a very simple process of finding a hadith and with the barest minimum of what a Muslim must do, and we can say that is the base minimum of what Islamic is, and we don't need to go beyond that. But because Islam has history,
which is a valid approach, right? In terms of the deen, that's the right way to go, I guess. the consensus plus that plus the consensus. But in terms of like culture and stuff, maybe it's a bit more complex.
If we're speaking of Islam as history, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I think politically as well is where that gets complicated. Like in the UK, it's a big thing about having a legal definition for Islamophobia, for example. It's something that's been, frankly, an ongoing battle because you have that for like anti-Semitism, which is why it's for someone or a statement or something to be labeled as anti-Semitic is rather, I suppose it happens a lot more easily than something or a person's actions being labeled as Islamophobic, because Islamophobia is still something that doesn't have a very clear definition, at least in a political sense. And what we see as well, despite that, is politicians and so on, they still use the term like Islamic radicalism, Islamic terrorism, and these things. And just yesterday, Emmanuel Macron, French president, made that statement saying Islam is in crisis. And he gave his whole wonderful speech about protecting secularism in France and so on, and all that wonderful stuff. And so, like, these terms get used whenever it suits these political agendas, but whenever it comes to issues of defending Muslims, it becomes a lot more difficult. With the example of the term Islamophobia being so difficult to at least push out and have an actual definition for. But I think part of this is the problem as well. Then in like actions that are actions that are good for Muslims and like done good by Muslims, don't get claimed as such, whereas actions that are then wrong or done by someone deranged then get claimed as with the term Islamic terrorism, Islamic radicalization, and these things. So I think, as well as culturally, I think the political spheres where it becomes a term that's very, I suppose, difficult to deal with and use correctly, and kind of, it's something, especially as Muslims, we've been dealing with for years and years now, and it doesn't look like, unfortunately, that's changing these days.
Bro, I attended a seminar, University of Bristol lecturer who was the author of the Labour definition of Islamophobia in the UK, right? And this definition, I think this is the definition that the Tories are using now. I'm not sure, don't take my word for it. But the definition he penned, Muslim lecturer himself, academic, he penned a definition in which the understanding of Islamic was cultural. Like there wasn't really much there other than culturally Islamic. So you have a situation where I asked him in the seminar, this is the exact question I asked. I said, we have two situations, A and B. A is you have a shop counter, a Asian lady in a hijab walks over to the manager of the shop, asks if she can get a job at the shop. He says no, because he says no, and it looks like he's being a bit, and it's proven that he doesn't like Muslims, blah, blah, blah. That is, under the definition, that's Islamophobic, because she is Muslim, and like visually. I said, situation B, you have a white, quote unquote, British convert, with a, maybe he's got a bit of a beard, right? But he's, just an average guy. Walks in, can I get a job? No, and it's also because he's a Muslim. That is not Islamophobic under the definition. He said to me that those situations would not be the same situation under the definition, because in the first situation, you are discriminating against. So for example, a Sikh, an attack against a Sikh is Islamophobic if the person who attacks them thinks they're a Muslim. But attack against so this is why you're right. That it's a very awkward, extremely awkward thing. Because then I think Khabib makes a really good point that, like, we could just go down the purist idea, right, and say that, does this guy believe in Allah and the six pillars of Iman, and but it's hard to get a secular law framework to do that, right? So I was wondering, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I think it touches on a point as well with what you're saying on the attempt to despiritualize Islam and despiritualize, what we like Muslims basically, by trying to define these terms purely as cultural. And we see it all the time in our media as well. Like the top shows that we see that get lauded for their portrayal of Muslims are Aziz Ansari's Master of None on Netflix. He's supposedly Muslim, but he drinks, he's poor, because no problem with that, and he's in has relationships and so on with women. And then the other one is Rami, again a show featuring and written, produced by a Muslim, Egyptian, American-born Egyptian, originally Muslim, and again, smoking weed, drinking, non-marital relations, all these things are present in this show. And these shows are lauded as, for their portrayal of Muslims, purely because, from what I can see looking at it, is it's good to show Muslims that aren't really practicing the religion. It's good to show Muslims that, or at least it's better to show them when they're not doing things that are correct according to our actual religion. Basically secularizing the religion. And it touches on, Kobe, something you said earlier as well about like the people who aren't as practicing in Islam but still identify themselves in that way, and kind of the mix, the lines that get blurred between religion and culture. Because in Rami, there's a part of the show where he goes to Egypt, and his reasoning is to get more in touch with his religion. But in another podcast I listened to, which was discussing this, a Boys in the Cave podcast, very good podcast. I recommend that you listen to that one after this one. It has one of the hosts of that podcast made the point that he's not really searching for religion. He's going there because of his culture. That's what he's actually looking for, and his actions reflect that as well. Because even when he's in Egypt, he still does things that are not correct in terms of our religion.
Is he looking for a space that utilizes and operates within an Islamic paradigm though? Because I think there's a scene where he goes, and it was on Twitter. It was like 2 minutes. And like he goes, and his cousin, I think it's like someone he meets at the airport, and he asks him, can we go to the masjid? And the guy asks him like what kind of music he likes and stuff, and the Egyptian guy starts talking about American music, and Rami's just thinking like, bro, like did I even change country? So it's almost as if he was looking for a different paradigm and he didn't find it.
Yeah.
So maybe is that what he was looking for? Perhaps.
They touch on that. Yeah, they do touch on that in the show. Like apparently, like I think. Like it's his cousin, I think, who like takes him around, and like basically he realizes in Egypt his family is not very religious either, which I guess was to try and show, whether you're in a non-Muslim country or a Muslim country is pretty much the same. Everyone's just doing what they want. And if you want to have that portrayal to some degree, fine, it makes sense. But like at the same time, it's still constantly spinning that narrative. There's like even when they have Muslims in that show, like they have a scene that it was on Twitter as well. I remember seeing the scene of like two guys talking about different, like their favorite qaris, basically like the reciters of Quran, and they're speaking about it as if these are rap artists, like the saying, or like this guy, is like it has a real nice lo-fi recitation, and it's so I'm like talking about the Quran in this manner. To be honest, I really did not like it, but like again, it touches on the secularization, I think, of Islam and how we view it. Yeah, exactly. And now one thing I will say in his defense, Rami's defense, that I do think we have to somewhat acknowledge is he said he wasn't trying to basically portray necessarily this is how Muslims are, be a representative for Muslims, and that the show basically it goes about it fits it kind of portrays his own experiences growing up. Like his family, from what I understand, weren't practicing really. He wasn't really raised as a practicing Muslim. And that's fine. Again, like, yeah, you have to acknowledge non-practicing Muslims do exist. And there are, people in our, unfortunately, communities that do things like drink or smoke.
Mari found that hilarious.
Oh, no, I was going to say,
funny
no. So it wasn't because I was actually going to bring this point up. I was waiting for you guys to finish, and I was going to try and bring this point up. That the issue isn't so much that Rami is like pushing this narrative of like secularizing Islam and look, Muslims are bad too. It's more representative. It's more a representation of how Muslims live in this Western culture. It was something because I was having these discussions in my masjid with some of my uncles there, my elders there, and he was saying like, oh, when you're giving the khutbah, like lace in the etiquette of the khutbah, remind them not to speak, remind them to respect the khutbah and to listen to the lecture. And I'm like, isn't this already a given? Shouldn't they already know this? And he's like, no, between me and you, it is only a minority of our children who are taught the etiquette of the khutbah. The vast majority of them are in the public schools and have very little exposure to orthodox standard understandings of Islamic etiquette and behavior, and they're kind of left to their own devices. So especially when we're talking about the American Muslim community, we're talking about, we basically have wide ranges of practicing and non-practicing and like everything on that spectrum. And that those who are practicing and committed to their practice of Islam and like actively attend the masjid weekly for Jum'ah or come for the rest of the obligatory prayers and spend time and are part of the community and actually have an understanding of their faith are actually a minority, whereas the vaster majority have a much more give and touch, like a much looser interaction with their faith. And that's something that I thought like should be recognized. And that's why I was laughing, because like the idea of non-practicing Muslims should be recognized. Of course they should. But we're talking about like that statement almost made it sound like that they were the minority and that the majority of Muslims were practicing, where perhaps the demographics can be shifted, that it could even be 50-50 or worse or whatnot, depending on your context. I know the UK the UK experience, the diaspora, the Muslim diaspora in the UK is much different than the American diaspora, the Muslim diaspora experience. And there's a lot of factors that go into that, but basically there's a lot going on here that's different.
Yeah.
Would you guys say that a show like Rami would be quote unquote Islamic?
That's so different. Yeah, I was thinking the exact same thing.
That's a great question. I actually think that's a great question. Yeah.
SubhanAllah, man.
I mean,
because the thing is that the only reason that exists is because he's a Muslim, and if he wasn't a Muslim, none of that story would exist, right? And it's the exact same as 1001 Nights, like you said, or it's the exact same as the quote unquote the philosophers. These things are really, from our like perspective, we don't like these like these things aren't great, right? As just from orthodoxy, they're not great, but like they only exist because they spring from this thing. And I don't know whether this is an observation. This is an observation, but I don't know what to do with it personally, because it's like they're still not quote unquote welcome, but they're the reality. Like they exist because, it's a tricky thing. I don't know what to do with it, because you have to accept that they only exist because they come from a Muslim source, but they don't come from. I mean,
it's not a pure spiritual source. It's not. They're not coming from the deen.
Yeah.
This is.
What are you thinking? They're not coming from the deen. They're coming from an interaction with the deen, right? It's like you have. It's in a physical model. You have a planet, and you have a meteorite that has been affected by the gravity of the planet, and it's moved. Its trajectory has changed because of the interaction, but it has nothing. It's taken nothing from the planet. I don't know. That was just a model I thought of. Okay, yeah. But I feel like you want to say something.
I think we're touching on something quite interesting, because I mean we brought up stuff from I guess Islamic history a few times. Things like 1001 Arabian Nights. You mentioned Rumi, Hafiz, of course, and many other things. For instance, I could bring up like the likes of Abu Nuwas and so forth, and so on and so forth. And I think in our tradition, at least, the agent of time is actually quite powerful, because we are a living tradition that's passed on from generation from generation to generation. And what tends to happen, at least, is I'm not sure why, but we tend to just by nature kind of glorify our history, clean it up a bit, and anything that's historical has just with purely by the fact of time gets this veneer of Islam and religiosity and purity, so that even things which, as Muhammad said earlier, things which were not necessarily written for any maybe religious purpose, which we can sit here today and we can speak with them, and it's like, oh, that was the glory of Islam. I can recite a poem here that has nothing to do with religion, that might actually be quite bad in its content, but we can sit here and be like, that was the glory. That was the glory of Islam. Look at that. And I'm seeing this even now, like with the likes of one of the, I guess, greatest Arab singers of the last century was an Egyptian lady called Kulthum. And you really do sense this kind of slowly as time goes on, there's this almost kind of Islamic pride in in the songs of Kulthum and so on, and her apparent modesty and so on, and everyone's like, there's a certain like Islamic something about even though of course she came from an Islamic background, and they say that she was a reciter of Quran when she was young, and that's where her talent was first seen. But it's quite interesting. We are that kind of, I guess, tradition. And perhaps with shows like Rami and so on, maybe they just need time, which is a bit terrifying, admittedly. Perhaps with time, the bad things about them will kind of disappear, and people will just think, that was the Muslims were doing something. Who knows? Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. I think the fact that I personally, the fact that I found that such a difficult question is a real red flag that shows that my way of understanding this is perhaps a bit awkward. Maybe it's not. I mean, sociologically it's not, because it makes sense. But in terms of, it's not comfortable. And I don't know whether I should be comfortable with the fact that it's not comfortable.
I mean, I'd say
because while accepting that this is not, halal, etc., tayyib, where does it go then, right? Do we just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that, like, from a sociological, historical perspective, what does it mean, right? Like, it's really uncomfortable.
Yeah,
I'd say the point is kind of in managing the inherent contradictions. There will always be contradictions. The world and life does not lend itself to complete purity, does not lend itself to an inherent whole that can be taken and consumed as is. There's always going to be some bruise on the apple that you need to cut out, and there will always be compromises in our lives. This is why I like looking at things like Alf Layla wa Layla, because we have these rose-tinted glasses as to the Islamic past. But if you open up a page and you read a story about like some random character who is consuming hashish and kind of just wandering around the city and his insane antics that are very clearly haram, and you recognize that they struggled with the same things we do today, it kind of reminds you that they're human too. And that this is just part of the test of the dunya, that there will always be contradictions, and we need to manage them. We need to not diminish the primacy of the orthodox understandings on like halal and haram and the deen itself, that this is king, deen is the king, and then everything else is just us trying to climb up the stairs towards that. And we benefit very little, I think, by either whitewashing the past and saying that there was nothing wrong in the past and ignoring our like past missteps, basically, or the issues in the past, or by giving the past an unnecessary religious veneer, that the good was still or that the bad was still somehow good because it was Islamic. That we kind of need to, in my mind at least, recognize the good and recognize the bad, and kind of going back to the cloud, recognize that the cloud does have dark patches in it. But as you said, the core is still pure and clean. Grasp onto the core and just kind of muddle your way through the rest of the cloud. One analogy, perhaps a bit better than a cloud and makes perhaps more sense, and is in some way rooted to Islamic history, is a tree. What's his name? There's an author whose name I'm completely forgetting. The Siyasatnama, Nizam al-Mulk. There we go. Nizam al-Mulk, who authors the Siyasatnama, comes out with this analogy, which he titles the tree of Islam. That the trunk or the seed is the Prophet ﷺ, is the religion itself, and then you have the branching out of the tree. And if you elaborate on the tree analogy, you have the potentiality for and the possibility for rotten branches, something that is a deviation from the trunk that ultimately can be disregarded, can be recognized as not being essentially part of the tree. And you can also
the purpose of the tree.
You can have like good fruits and bad fruits. You can transplant branches of the tree elsewhere. You can transplant branches from other trees into the main tree. But the idea is kind of to recognize the tree and the unity of the tree. So this is the tree of Islam. But then like culture is one branch, deen is the other branch. Imam Ghazali and Kulthum and Rami all occupy three different branches of the tree. but without necessarily saying that Imam Ghazali has absolutely nothing to do with Rami or like American Muslims. Even though if you've walked into a masjid and sat through a khutbah, there is like an 80% chance you have heard someone who has either read Imam Ghazali or has quoted Imam Ghazali to you. So yeah, that's just my kind of 2 cents on it.
I think with
A lot of great metaphors.
I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Shahab Ahmed's Finding Islam, and the ideas he discusses when it comes to this, because I think he's at least within academic circles, and I guess among students of Islamic studies and so on, he's the big figure when it comes to this. So perhaps some discussions of what he's saying might be actually quite beneficial, if any of you are familiar with that.
I mean, I've come across some interactions with him. I haven't actually read his work, but I know, at least from my friend, from the circles I'm in, it was not received with open arms. Because my understanding of his work is that it allows for kind of for some of these darker bits or these bad bits within the Islamic past to have a veneer of authority, that you can talk about an authentically Islamic tradition of wine drinking, disregarding the kind of Quranic, unanimous, clear condemnation of wine drinking and alcohol and whatnot. But I mean, I can't speak to that because I have not engaged with the work personally.
Just very quickly, I think it's interesting how we maintain the primacy of scripture and stuff, and the primacy of the orthodoxy, because when we don't have that, what we're seeing more and more in kind of today's age is you'll have this idea that everything is on a level playing field, and there's no judge of what is more appropriate. So you have I was watching some Muslims in Britain, Muslims like us, some documentary, in which you had a very staunch, mashallah, very, maybe you could say over the top Salafi brother, who was having a discussion with a lady who said, I don't pray, I write letters to God, right? And the entire purpose of that documentary was to present a variety of Muslims and say that everybody, people live differently, and, everyone's on their own page because they're all from the Muslim cloud, right? But there's no foundation, and so because you can't judge it by anything, you judge it by nothing, and everything's fine. It's an interesting challenge how we keep the primacy of and the importance of a measuring stick.
Yeah.
Because the cloud without the center is pointless, or the tree without the trunk, right?
Yeah. Shout out to brother Abdul Haq. I remember watching that documentary.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. That honestly, that. I mean, if you can call it a documentary, it frustrated me so much.
You guys should watch it. It's really interesting.
It is interesting. It is interesting, but I think it's frustrating as well at the same time, because like the thing is, like if we take brother Abdul Haq as an example, so he was a revert, and very much in the documentary, and in terms of his personality, they tried to frame him, as someone, very extreme, very overzealous, and so on. Because he's reverted and this stuff, and like to some degree, yeah, fair enough. I could see why, given his nature, and that the other people that he would interact with would seem that way. But at the same time, the one thing I think he deserves credit for, compared to everyone else that was in that documentary, everyone else would just say how basically derive opinions based off how they feel or what their wants are, whereas his were derived from what he believed is from his religion, from the Quran, from Sunnah, from basically the laws that are prescribed. So you can argue about whether he was too strict on certain things, and certainly I think his own, just the way his people skills probably were not the best, even though I think his intentions generally were good. But it's at least he had a foundation for what his stance was on these things. Whereas I remember there's one brother, I can't remember his name in the show, but like he just like I didn't like I found him frustrating because he clearly was just basically going through life without really thinking. Like his remember at the start he's saying like I think he was Pakistani, and at the start he's saying like one day his sister and his mom just said to him, you're gonna get married today or something like that very soon. He was like, oh really, okay. boy or girl. He said that as a joke. I was like, it's clear that he's just going off basically what the path that is set in front of him without actually doing any critical thinking or being self-aware. And he wasn't alone in that, I think.
Yep. And bro, in today's time, it's very easy to pass that off as I'm just doing what I want.
Yeah.
Right. I'm living for Anyway,
it's very true. And I remember there was one point as well. I remember where they decide to go out, go on a night out, and one of the sisters in that show, she went with them, and I remember distinctly she said basically she clearly acknowledged it's not right where they are. They're in a club and stuff. There's alcohol around them, people drinking around them, and I can't remember the exact quote, so I'll paraphrase, but it was basically like saying I think it's important for people to see me in a place like this because I don't think I should always be a representative for my religion. And I remember watching that and thinking, that's not up to you. That's not your decision. You don't get to choose when a person looks at you as an example of what a Muslim is and then doesn't. That's not how it works. And I think it's a very, very dangerous, very, very dangerous thought process to have.
But I mean, at the same time, I can understand her sentiment in that I don't want to be the standard. Like, if you're looking for a good Muslim, don't look at me. This isn't what I am. And I can understand that emotional sentiment. But at the same time, this comes into like modulating people's external kind of views on us. And the issue with like racism and essentializing and all that is that on some level people can't separate or won't separate between different aspects of someone's life. It can be easy for you to compartmentalize, but to ask someone else to compartmentalize your life or to agree to those compartmentalizations is tricky. I had another point that I was going to say. There was this idea of Brother Abdul Haq seeming kind of extreme because he had some sort of guidelines to live his life by. It reminded me of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he says, "Bada al-Islamu ghariban wa sayaudu ghariban fatuba lil-ghuraba." The Islam began as a stranger and will return to being a stranger, and so give glad tidings to the strangers that in a world where ultimately what we want and the instant gratification of our impulses and emotions is king, to adhere to some set of standards would be seen as extreme because you can talk about the intellectual trajectory of this kind of erosion of top-down authorities, where you are sovereign in your own self, where you are the one who dictates the course of your life, not beholden to any human master or celestial master. And then you have someone who comes out of nowhere who says, "I will live my life bound by these kind of." Bound by these authorities within this structure, within this framework, and it can be jarring, basically.
I'm conscious that Khabib wanted to say something, but I just want to throw in a quote very quickly. G.K. Chesterton, a Christian, I think he was Catholic, theologian, philosopher from the past couple of centuries, he said something very interesting. He said, modern people, I'm paraphrasing, he said, modern people will not accept any dogma on an authority, but they'll accept any dogma on no authority. Modern people won't accept the dogma on any authority, but they will accept any dogma on no authority. Right? It's this idea that you don't want to be pinned to anything. Right? Morality, by definition, is choosing what not to do. Right? And that's a very uncomfortable thing for people for some reason. It's this idea that we'll do anything apart from being told what not to do. But yeah, a bit.
I find that very interesting, and I guess it's perhaps a topic for another podcast, but certainly something we should perhaps discuss in more detail. I guess my point was just with regards to what you were saying, Muhammad, about there are many Muslims who do go out there and say, "I'm not a representative. Don't look at me if you want a good Muslim." And I just find that phrase in itself, it's very interesting because first of all, it suggests that first of all, they don't consider themselves a good Muslim. They have a conception of what a good Muslim is. They understand that what they are is not a good Muslim. And then what usually comes along with that is this sense of when they do find somebody who fits their definition of a good Muslim. It's there's almost a sense of pity. Oh my God, you've taken onto yourself all these burdens, and you're carrying the standard banner for everyone else. You're so brave, and exactly. And I just find that quite. It reminds me of the point I made at the beginning, where you have a lot of Muslims who do believe that Islam is the way, and they identify with it very strongly, but they just don't seem to have the courage or the will or whatever it is to actually live according to the principles they clearly believe are true and correct. And I think we just it's a sad state of affairs that we do seem to think that to live by our principles is some kind of chain, or when truly it isn't. It's the ultimate form of freedom. But perhaps we're straying slightly from from the point at hand. Yeah.
As is the nature of
that's the case. I'll back on the last comment.
That's the beauty of this podcast. This is unstructured. That's the approach we like to take.
That's the USP of this podcast in particular. There's no other podcast
exactly.
like it.
You know what? I think though that's it's actually a good note to conclude on. I think, yeah, it definitely touches on I think an insecurity of people. Like we want to, I think a lot of Muslims, they want to be viewed as Muslim, but at the same time they don't want to be viewed as the Muslim. That's the challenge. And I think it's something that we have to kind of try and get into the mindset that our deen and living by it is not this big scary thing and not this impossible task. It's not about being perfect, but by striving to be the best that we can be, and that's always going to be a lifelong journey.
And that it's important to see that Muslim is, I'm sure, that's not really in Arabic, is it? Because meme on the front of it. Anyway, it's more of a verb than a noun, even though that's not strictly the case in Arabic, I guess. It's a verb that's become a noun, isn't it? But we can just pretend that's not the case.
Yeah.
It's an action. You can't just label yourself. Surah Al-Asr. Like the entire message is that it's a positive thing. Everyone's in loss except the people who believe, do good deeds, remind each other to truth, remind each other to solve patience. Right? Like this is a definition of action, not of identity, right? So it's you kind of have to be the Muslim, right? Because it's not a passive thing.
That is the goal. It's in the journey. It's not about the destination. It's
exactly.
the journey.
Doing something, because that is what defines you.
Exactly. And you know what? That was beautifully said. And that's how we're going to conclude this podcast, mashallah. That's why I brought you guys on. All three of you complement each other very well, mashallah. So jazakallah khair, guys. This was a really good discussion. Jazakallah khair to all of you for listening, and inshallah we will see you on the next episode from all of us here at Finding Islam. Take care, and assalamu alaikum.